evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be going over the brief history and geography of Mauritius. Let me just say real quick, it is super windy outside tonight. Like, the house is shaking windy. If you hear a little creak outside, that is a street sign outside my window that is like blowing in the wind really, really hard. So I can't really control the weather, so there's not much I can do about that. So anyway, I let it up the worst of the gusts, but I don't know, when it's really windy, it almost kind of sounds like the ocean, so it's kind of soothing. Let me know what you think, but yeah, it's a windy one tonight. But anyway, we're talking about Mauritius today. Mauritius is a chain of islands, actually, quite a few islands. Belongs to Africa. It's off the coast of Madagascar toward the east. It is a really beautiful place. Let me say that. I don't have any books or anything to show you, which I'm really sad about because it's an absolutely gorgeous little island. The main island of Mauritius. It has, oh, there's the wind. It has this island. It has the island of Rodriguez, you can see down here, belongs to Mauritius. There's also quite a few other islands that belong to Mauritius. There is the islands of St. Brandon, which are very sparsely populated, along with the Chagos Archipelago, which we're going to address later on in its history. And there are the Agalega Islands, which are also very sparsely populated. Most of the little islands around Mauritius and the archipelagos I mentioned aren't inhabited, so they belong to Mauritius, but most of them are nature reserves that nobody lives on. There's also another island called Tromelin, which Mauritius claims, but France also claims it, which we'll discuss that in its history too. But Mauritius is part of the Mascarenes Island chain. I'll talk about how it gets that name later on and how the name Mauritius came to be. Let me just point out some parts of the island here. There's the highest peak right here. This is Piton de la Rivière Noire. It's very French, you can see that. The capital here is Port Louis. And all along the coast here we have gorgeous, gorgeous beaches. Absolutely beautiful beaches. Most of them are private. Like, there's some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. Same with Rodriguez, it's also populated. Mount Limon is its highest peak. Not as populated as Mauritius, which these cities are actually quite large, and if we're growing, it's apparently an environmental issue how big the cities are growing, because most of the island is covered in this lush, beautiful, jungly forest. It's also pretty mountainous. It is a volcanic island. All the volcanoes in the island chain are extinct, so there's no threat to that, but that's how the islands were created. And yeah, it's a gorgeous little island. I can't say that enough. I've been watching all these videos about it, and it just makes me want to go so bad. Absolutely beautiful beaches, absolutely beautiful hiking, climbing up the mountains. It's gorgeous. And you can see around here, they have a huge coral reef around the islands. You can see there, Mauritius is home to the third largest coral reef in the world. Mauritius, what it's best known for, the little fact that I want to get you in your head before you fall asleep, is that it is where the dodo bird once lived. Nobody lived on Mauritius before it was colonized by the Europeans. So the dodo birds had no predators. They, evolved to not be able to fly. They were really big birds. They were like 3 feet tall. They weighed anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds. They were just these huge birds just roaming around the island. So when settlers, mainly the Portuguese, came and used them for food, they called them dodos because, these birds had never seen people before and they'd never been threatened, so they kind of wandered right up to them. So they thought, wow, these are stupid birds, so they called them dodos. And, they ate a lot of the birds. Once there were settlers, their livestock and dogs, things they would bring to the island, would eat the eggs of the dodo birds, so they all went extinct. The last one was sighted in 1662. And there are actually lots of fossil sites around the island where people have found dodo bones, so we can reconstruct them and see what they look like, because there are no photographs of dodo birds ever made. So we can only guess what they looked like based off of drawings and first-hand accounts of people who saw them and presumably ate them. I bet they tasted like chicken, but anyway. And some people do call, Mauritians call this island Dodo Land also. Another interesting thing about Mauritius, that it's only one of 3 countries that has a majority religious population of Hindus, the other 2 being India and Nepal, which you'll learn about in its history. Let's get right into it. There's lots of little random facts about Mauritius that I've learned, so I might just pepper them into the video as I go along. But Mauritius, as we know it, is first documented in 1502. The islands, Mauritius mainly, had been sighted long before that by the Arabs that sailed in the sea there, going to and fro with their trades. They ignored it. Really, they didn't see any need to go there. But they did recognize it. And in 1502, when we first see it appear on an Italian map, it was labeled as Dina Ararobi, Arab, like they had seen the island. And I guess the Arabs called this island chain Wak Wak, which is an awesome name, I think. But people were definitely in the know about these islands. They just never went because they were covered in forest and nobody lived there. There were no humans there at all. So the first time people started to, land there was in 1507. The Portuguese sailed by and decided to set up a little temporary base, thinking that it would be my cat. I gave my cat some salmon today because he's chomping down on it. Anyway, the Portuguese figured it would be a good base between Africa and India and their forest territories over there, to have a little stopping point. It was a very temporary base, though. It didn't quite work out. Kind of like the wind you hear outside. It seemed that any time someone tried to colonize it, there would be cyclones, natural disasters, there would be pests, there would be plague, things like that. So Mauritius was attempted to be colonized many times, and they failed almost every time, except for the last one, obviously. So the Portuguese base originally didn't go out as planned. So the next time it was visited significantly was in 1512 by an explorer named Pedro Mascarenhas, which is how the Mascarene Islands get their name. Another sailor in 1528 claimed this island. His name was Diogo Rodriguez, which is why this island is still named Rodriguez. It's named after him. He landed on it, he named it. No one else was there anyway. Totally fair. But the Portuguese, they tried, it failed, they moved on. It was nice to look at, but they didn't bother living there. So the Dutch got the idea to try to make it into a little plantation island. So they started settling down there in 1598, and they named the island Mauritius after their Prince Maurice of Nassau. Mauritius. They set out to chop down the ebony trees and sell that, and they also brought sugarcane with them and started setting up sugarcane plantations as part of the Dutch East Indian Company. And it really started to get successful around 1638. And since it started to get successful, around 1639, the first slaves were brought over to Mauritius. At first, they came from Madagascar, southeastern Africa. Later on, it would be India and those parts of Asia. However, a lot of slaves managed to escape from the plantations and live out in the woods here. So, an escaped slave who lived out in the wild was called a maroon. So, this island got a reputation for having a lot of maroons on it, which there is a big mountain rock where the slaves famously hid out at the most point. It's not noted on my map. I'm kind of bummed about that, but anyway. So by 1710, the Dutch gave up on Mauritius and left. They had tried many, many times to bring in, governors to run the island, businessmen to grow sugarcane, and it just constantly, something would always happen every single time, and the governor would quit. Usually having to do with like cyclones, natural disasters, pest infestations, things like that. So the Dutch gave up and left, and also by this time the dodo birds were definitely gone. So the next people to come and try and actually succeed were the French. They arrived in 1715 and claimed the island for France. They named it Ile de France, and they started to set up their own sugar plantations and use the ebony trees. The original maroons were all gone by then. But, a new population of maroons started to come, since they also brought in many, many slaves to work these plantations, like way more than the Dutch did. And also these slaves also came from Madagascar, India, and Eastern Africa. At one point, at like the height of the plantation age of Mauritius, slaves consisted of 80% of the population. There were just many, many slaves on this island. My goodness, there were a lot. There was a brief moment of chaos during the French Revolution where they were just kind of left to fend for themselves. But, France figured itself out and French rule came back onto the island. And Napoleon was the famous French ruler after the French Revolution. So once they went to war with England, they used Mauritius as a naval base to attack British ships. So Port Louis had been well established by then. And that's where they were, sending out their ships to attack the British. So there was a naval battle here during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1810, the Battle of Grand Port. And it's actually the only French naval battle that resulted in a victory during the Napoleonic Wars. They defeated the British and saved their island. Except that the British wound up invading 3 months later and, conquered the island. They renamed the island back from Ile de France to Mauritius. I guess they liked the name. And they struck a deal with the Mauritians that they could continue to speak French and have their French customs and, live their traditional French style of life, but they wouldn't be controlled by the British. And then during the Treaty of Paris, which was the agreement between Britain and France over who would, get the territories that they fought over and claimed, France handed Mauritius over to England. Listen to the wind. Oh boy, it's so windy outside. And this was kind of tricky because their agreement with Mauritius was worded a certain way that it would come back to bite them in the future. Mainly with the island of Tromelin, like I mentioned in the beginning. They didn't mention Tromelin in the agreement, so France assumed that they still owned it. It's like a little loophole. Mauritius today, claims that island because France once owned Mauritius. France once owned Tromelin. Tromelin was part of Mauritius. It's a whole wording situation. My cat's coming to ruin the shot once again. Yeah, it's okay. Come on, kitty. You gotta stop doing this, cat. If you knock over the camera, I'm not going to be very happy. Cat, you... Okay. Alright. Moving on with this huge cat in the way. Where was I? Tromelin. There's also... Come on, kitty cat, get in my lap. There's also the Chagos Archipelago, which Britain definitely claimed, and we'll get to that later on in its history. Come on, kitty cat, get in my lap. Maybe you can make some purr sounds for us. There you go. He's old, he moves kind of slow. There we go. Hi, kitty. So, Britain now owns Mauritius, and they, take over the whole plantation economy. But it wasn't long after that slavery was abolished in 1835. And there's also a very sad moment in their history when the police went to find the Maroons in the forest to tell them that they were free and they no longer needed to hide. And the Maroons thought that they were coming to be recaptured, so they jumped off of the mountain that they were camping on. It's a very sad part of their history. There's a memorial at the top of the mountain for, those people very tragically lost their lives unnecessarily. Very sad part of Mauritius's history. So, Britain decided to try something they called the Grand Experiment, where they set up a little base to bring in indentured servants. Now, indentured servants are technically not slaves. They are people who are brought over from a different country, and they work off a debt, usually a debt on, how they got there. No, kitty, you're not getting back on the book. Sorry. A debt on how they got there, a debt for their living expenses, their housing, their food, things like that. And once they'd managed to pay off their debt, no, kitty. Once they'd managed to pay off their debt, then they would be free to live their lives. So many people came, mostly from India, to Mauritius to, start a new life on this island, working as an indentured servant. I'm holding my cat back. Working as an indentured servant, and, eventually living on the island as a free person. And between 1834 and 1921, hundreds of thousands of people came from Africa, Asia, China also. There's still a large Chinese population on Mauritius, but it was mostly India. No, kitty cat, you can't go back on the map. I know you want to. Stop. We try to give him scratches so he calms down. Now we have a very large population of Indians on the island, and of course, they don't get any kind of voting rights or say in their local government because, they're indentured servants. Oh, there he goes. Okay, bye, kitty. Bye, cat. Go back to sleep. They were servants, indentured servants, and also they were brown, so obviously Britain didn't want to give them too many rights, Just putting that up there. So, slowly but surely movements started to bring, civil rights to the people who live on this island. Because like I said, once they work off their debt, they're free to live their lives on the island. So it's not fair that, once they're finally free of this basically slave labor, like quote unquote slave labor, that, they're still living a repressed life, making small wages, not having any political say. And here we start to see Mauritian Creole develop from, combination of African, French culture, Indian culture, all mushed together. It's really interesting demographics on this island. And this is why there's such a large population of Hindu people on this island, and has a Hindu majority in terms of religious demographics because so many people came from India. Even Gandhi visited Mauritius in 1901 when he was going to South Africa. He stopped on Mauritius on the way and really encouraged people to, speak out for their rights that they, should have. So there were many different protests, there were riots, things of that nature to bring, rights, representation, things like that into the local population. During this time, like the early 1900s, most of the political sway in Mauritius was held by the sugarcane plantation owners because the sugar sales and their economy went hand in hand. During World War I, the price of sugar skyrocketed. So lots of people made lots of money, so they wanted to pass laws to make sure that they would continue to make that kind of money. But it wasn't always fair to everybody. So there are a lot of protests and riots, and people did lose their lives during some of these riots, very sadly. But justice slowly made its way into the political sphere. In 1926, the first Indo-Mauritians were elected to the Legislative Council after more protests and riots, especially after World War II, because, once you fight for a country that doesn't respect you once you go home, that just makes you very mad. So a new constitution was drafted in 1947 that allowed more people the right to vote. And then, that led to a lot of political changes because now there were more people who were able to run for election, more people to campaign for. Changes started happening. So by 1926, there was another new constitution that declared their independence. And on March 12th of that year, they were able to fully become independent. Their first prime minister was Siwa Ramgoolam, who I mentioned just because he's a very important figure in Mauritian history. They would eventually become a republic in the Commonwealth of Nations on March 12th, 1992. Fully becoming their own independent nation, separate from Britain, finally. However, backpedaling a little bit, let's go back to the Chagos Archipelago, because Britain set up their own overseas territories in the Indian Ocean, literally like a year and a half before they officially declared independence. So Mauritius thought, those are our islands, it belongs to us. You need to give them back. And Britain basically was like, no. For one, the largest island, named Diego Garcia, they loaned out to the Americans to use as a naval base. And they actually, I want to say like 10, 15 years ago, they extended that agreement to go through 2036. So that island today is an American naval base. Also, Britain claimed that nobody lived on most of those islands anyway, so what's the big deal? However, people did live on those islands, a lot of them. So Britain did some really nasty things to get those people to forcefully leave the island so that they would be uninhabited. It's really awful what they did. Mauritius has taken this issue to the United Nations and has been, fighting for the Chagos Archipelagans for justice so that they could finally return home after so long. And finally in 2019, the UN did officially announce that the Chagos Archipelago belonged to Mauritius. And, steps are slowly being made to get those islands back under control of Mauritius and out of control of Britain. That's still ongoing. I did mention Napoleon. Yeah, because of the treaty. Yeah, okay. Most recently, in 2020, in July of that year, a Japanese oil carrier crashed into the coral reef and spilled over 1,000 tons of oil out into the coral and the beaches and the ocean, creating the worst environmental disaster in Mauritian history. That's still an ongoing story. Getting justice for the land and the wildlife going between Mauritius and Japan. And cleanup is expected to finally be completed by early 2021. It's January 2021 as I film this, so it's still an ongoing issue. But in a nutshell, that is basically the history of Mauritius. It's more recent history since it became a republic. Many protests, pushing for, equal rights, equal opportunities, labor laws, things like that, which have been successful, which, personally, I don't like to put too many personal opinions in my videos, but I think it's a sign that your democracy is working when you have protests, to be honest. Having protests means that your people have free speech, so that's always good. And also when those protests are heard and implemented into law, it's even better. So the main political issues surrounding Mauritius, like I mentioned in the beginning, is the privatization of a lot of land on Mauritius, where like wealthy millionaires and billionaires are buying up islands and beaches, and more and more land is becoming privatized. Also, the cities are ever expanding out into the forests. Mauritius does have a very active environmental campaign, especially after what happened to the dodo bird, because dodo birds are a symbol of animals going extinct. They're like a warning for the rest of us to take care of the animals that we have. And the dodo bird is on their coat of arms also. So there's always a lot of environmental movements to preserve the natural flora and fauna of the island, of other islands, I should say. But the cities are ever expanding, skyscrapers, suburbs, things like that, all these cities you see here. So that's also an issue. But like I said in the beginning, Mauritius is a stunningly beautiful island. I really wish I had a book or something to show you, but all that my library had was like tour guides, like telling you like where to eat and where to stay. Nothing to really, there's like one paragraph about their history, so not very interesting. But the history of Mauritius, I think, is really neat. I bet you didn't know where dodo birds lived before this video. Or maybe you did. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, that's all I really have for Mauritius. I apologize for this short video, but like I said, I don't have a lot of extra content to show you about the island. Hopefully someday soon we can talk about it more, especially since there's so many different islands around Mauritius. There's Réunion, which is still owned by France, which is their closest island neighbors. The Seychelles Islands are just north of them. So and then the Comoros Islands are like north of Madagascar, where Mauritius is east of Madagascar. So, and then of course there's Madagascar. Lots of islands out there. So we'll mention Mauritius someday soon again when we get to all of those islands and nations. But that's where I'm going to leave you for the night. Thank you so much for watching. Magically, the wind seemed to have died down after I started recording, so thank you, wind. And I will see you all tomorrow for the next video. Have a good night. Good night. Good night.